Hi, guys. Thanks for joining. This is Essence of Life. Today, we're going to be talking about how we see the world. We're focusing on power and morality. I'm Amanda Armagost.
I'm Melissa Hopper.
Dominic Moore.
And I'm Dr. Abbasi for Essence.
So, today, the question is, what is the relationship between power and morality? And can power be wielded ethically, or does it corrupt inherently? This is a topic actually chosen by the one and only Dominic Moore. So I'm going to let Dominic start by answering that question. Dom, what do you think is the relationship between power and morality?
Well, actually, okay. So it's always an interesting topic when you come to it. We can go as far back as like kings and emperors, the idea of can you have somebody with absolute power in those situations? So we're not talking about a senator here. We're talking about this man makes a choice and these things happen.
A dictator.
Yeah, essentially. These ones chosen by God back in the day or whatever religious entity they used to justify their reign, whatnot. In those cases, can you have a just dictator? Mm-hmm. Can you have somebody with absolute authority who is morally pro? In a lot of cases, you see this happen all the times in media and literature and whatnot, and even in history. People can start off with the best of intentions, but as situations become more complex, not everything is just 1 + 1 = 2, then the solutions become perhaps a little simpler, but a lot more violent or drastic. And so a lot of the times, migrate towards that.
So is dictator a good word or a bad word?
Usually a bad word.
When did it become a bad word? Do you ever think about that? When did we start being so as we are now? Like
yes, but not that one.
Mussolini. Yeah. What is a Mussolini? Mussolini was a fascist, right? Is fascist a good word or a bad word?
I believe we associate it negatively these days.
But Mussolini called himself a fascist. Or like Nazis, they called themselves Nazis. For them, it wasn't a bad word. So coming back to that, when did the absolute power as a dictator implies became as we understand it now?
I say I don't know the actual correct answer, but I know most of the time I have my own preformed definition of what I think. So I would think a dictator in my own form until somebody that is a dictator comes in and changes my mind. AKA, I'm guessing we had some sort of poor forms of dictatorship that then warped the definition or how we see dictatorship.
I'm going to tell you, in your lifetime, dictator became a bad word. Fascist and Nazi became a bad word after Second World War, after we saw what the consequences of fascism is. Until recently, even in your lifetime, many of the African dictators, they would be happy to call themselves dictator.
Yeah, because I guess if you think of like the definition of dictator, like dictate, someone who's dictating, someone who's making the rules and saying like pretty much what you should do.
So, absolute power in the hand of one person.
So is it like Fidel Castro that really kind of twisted things up, or is that?
Yeah, Fidel Castro, you could say he's a dictator, but there are many levels of being a dictator. Coming back to our podcast, it's a question about power and morality. And often in life, the power dictates the morality and not vice versa. But that is not specific to dictators. I just want to understand that it's not just that dictators define our morality. Democracy can define our morality.
A lot of things like religion can define.
Religion. Religion is, as a matter of fact, absolute power, because there is an instant that you cannot ask behind it what is the reason for that, because God said so. No, but let's take the shining democracy. Okay? Let's take our shining democracy and put it on a pedestal. And let's use something very similar. Based on law and our democracy, marrying somebody who's 12 years old is not really allowed, right? When did that happen? When did we stop marrying off or having sexual relationship with 12-year-old girls? United States. In United States, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia and
Yeah,
Africa and so
Probably
on.
in like the 60s.
Well, until, in the first half of the 20th century, 19 to 1950 in South and so on, it was something completely normal.
Mhm.
As soon as you were through the puberty, you would be married off. I mean, this is not long ago. But then we came together, and that was the democracy.
Mhm.
Okay, so our sense of morality, as we understand it now, is based on what our power structure dictates. Now, power structure happened to be United States democracy. But the majority now, let's see that now, who invented the democracy? The Athenian, right?
Yeah, back in Greece.
But that was not a democracy. It was, as a matter of fact, they knew that if you give the power to the populace, meaning
Mhm.
everybody, that is the most horrible way of governing. What you want to say, people who understand nothing just have a saying in how we run the. If you read the old antique books, it was more an aristocracy and an oligarchy, meaning
Mhm.
that the people with power and people with wisdom would dictate how it goes, but then they would among themselves they would decide it democratically.
Mhm.
And then let's go back to that, and then based on what they decide, they enforce their moralities. Like, if you wouldn't pray to Zeus, you would be killed. It would be okay to kill you. As a matter of fact, everybody who has read The Last Day of Socrates by Plato understand how they enforce their rules of morality. What was Socrates accused of?
I don't know.
To destroy the moral of the youth, because he made them question status quo. So you understand this anger of lots of people against what we consider moral and not even law. Okay? They didn't say that he broke the laws.
Mhm.
He destroyed the moral of the youth. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you another thing that speak to the power and morality structure. And that was my deep sigh when I heard you guys going to talk about that. This is such a contentious field.
Mhm.
Okay. Socrates was a very short stature, by any regard, small, fat, ugly person.
Very descriptive.
He describes him
but-
any chance he gets.
But his mind was beyond anybody else there. Young men would run after him to be his disciple. In that time, 300 BC, being disciple of Socrates means Socrates, you would sleep with Socrates and you give him sexual pleasure. Look at that now. What's your take on that?
If you have been in the media today and all of everything that's coming out, it's full circle right now. This is relevant.
No.
I think that's never been something that ever stopped. Like,
Very true.
it's
No, but
true.
But at that time, that was not an immoral thing. That was not. They would throw. This is what is say. People they don't discuss that in your textbook and so on. Young man would throw himself at him, and that was not an immoral thing at that time. He had mind. He had the power. And everybody knew. It's not like nobody knew. Like
It's not a scandal,
it
just
wasn't a
as
scandalous thing at all. It was what it was, and the power at that time said having sex with the almost barely in puberty young boys with a 60-year-old man. That was. It is what it is. The power said it's okay. Well, they had slaves, right? They had slaves. When you would go, and lots of what you consider morality went from Greek to Roman, then spread with Roman, and then we put it together and became our status of our laws and morality and so on. And let me be very clear about that. If you have any question about that, go read the books that Christianity didn't change the Europe. Europe changed the Christianity to fit European culture.
Yeah.
It is, Christianity is a Middle Eastern Jewish thing. But that could never come to Europe. Europe had its own thing for a very, very long time. So you have heard Saulus became Paulus? You don't know that?
I
The
don't.
phrase Saulus, from Saulus to Paulus, or Saulus became Paulus. So there is a very good book. It's called The Zealot by Reza Aslan. I absolutely recommend for everybody. This is the most historically correct and scholarly backed book that you can read about how the Christianity started, how it came to Europe, and how it impregnated our idea of life and morality in Europe. And make no mistake, when you guys talk about morality and power, you're talking about Western. You're not talking about anything else. Even if you think you're talking about something deeper, you are not. So there were these so-called the Zealots about 100 years before the Christianity, and there were multiple revolts, because at that time the Roman dictated the law of the land. They dictated what morality was, but the Jewish, they have their own. For them the morality, and they abided by the laws of the Roman, and that is always where the conflict comes. When two groups come together, that their idea of morality is not the same, and one group has more power, then they always obviously enforce their rules of morality and so on. And that was for Jewish people, that was, what? You want to tell us how our moral life should look like? So they were the zealots. They wanted to uproot that and go back to the Judean origin root. So what they did is that they were revolts, numerous. The last revolt was actually 770 after the birth of the Christ, where the Roman decimated. They destroyed any Jewishness in the land, in the Holy Land. Okay, because it was until then they tolerated them. They were forcing their laws. With the laws always come the morality. So, and then practically the most anti-Christian, they were actually some of the zealot Jews, because it wasn't like that was just one direction, it was many directions. Saulus is one of the people who collaborated with Roman, understood the Roman the best, and then was working with them to put down the early Christians. According to the story, and that eventually he had a revelation, and the Saulus became the Paulus and became the most advocate for Christianity, but he had an advantage. He knew the Roman culture. Whereas Christianity wasn't made for Europe, it was made for this group of Jewish, in that time frame, in the Holy Land. Paulus understood the Roman culture. He understood how Roman, because he was a spy. He was collaborating with them to kill the Christian. There was another problem. He actually persecuted the Christians so much, he was hated in Holy Land. So these two came together. He knew the Roman. He knew how to turn them around, like how to wrap them around their finger, and he could not stay in Holy Land, so he went to exile to Rome.
So we have about 8 minutes left. What do you think is the relationship between power and, like, I know you gave us a lot of background, but
I got an idea.
So morality is.
So what do I want to say?
Well, I think the biggest connection that we're seeing, even just from a medical side of things that we talk about a lot, is how much people value what you say, what you do, just based on who you are. As a doctor, people value what you say, your advice. So if you say, Amanda, that space bar right there, that's going to cause you to lose 3 months of your life every time you press it. Normal people would be like, oh, that's crazy. But because it's coming from a respected adult that has this power, you eventually go, you know what? I believe it.
Right.
And you see that trickle over time. How someone in power can virtually cause you to believe or do about anything.
So I'm trying to tell all three of you, your sense of morality comes from the power structure under which you have lived.
Yeah, morality is more,
So
it's very individualized. Everyone else has their own sense of what is moral.
not everyone, but your culture. It's a cultural thing. Before you judge somebody else's morality, you have to understand your own morality has been pushed on you by the cultural power that reigns you.
Mhm.
But
To some extent.
don't you think like you can grow up in a culture and see things in your culture that some people say are moral and you think they're not?
That you call them rebel.
Mm.
And you know what they do with the rebel? They burn them on the stake.
I think
But not necessarily anymore though. I think now in 2024, like
Really?
I can disagree with people and not get burned at the stake.
I
Yeah,
think
well-
we had this
Morally.
conversation between myself and Amanda. As you know, everyone kind of knows I'm from small town South Dakota
Yeah.
for the most part, and that I will say is a very cultural place. That is very different.
You will be ostracized. You know, but this is a bubble to believe that you can rebel against the power structure which is enforced by the setting of what the moral instances are. As a matter of fact, I think this right now in the United States, that is why Trump gets so much attention. People say this, I am tired of this.
Mhm.
This moral structure. Okay, he slept with the porn star. I don't care. You remember we were just there. People say, this power structure has been governing my whole life. All this morality comes from that. So I'm dismissing all of that. Reality doesn't matter to me anymore. Power doesn't matter. The morality doesn't matter anymore. That what he said bad thing, he mocked people, he's a mean person, he slept with a porn star. I don't care anymore. But you see that is not a reality that can govern, but we are tired of this. People do understand that how they are limited by the morality that power put in place. So, and I think it is just in certain bubbles you can live. You think you really can do what you want to do. You will be ostracized. You will be put down. You will not get a job. You will lose your license. You will, if you don't abide by what it's by the power is called moral. So you ask me what the relationship is? It's an equal sign.
You think they're equal?
For all practical purpose, they are. Well, if you think they are not equal, then you don't understand the whole history, how we got to our morality.
The last thing I'll add for it is I read a while back a book called Moral Tribes, and essentially it kind of details in there how a lot of society is broken up into these smaller moral tribes. So, for example, you're from a smaller town,
Mhm.
and even though a lot of your moralities are probably similar to what everybody else has here, I bet what you have in that small town is rather homogenous.
Yeah.
So, like, your
No,
neighbor
absolute-
probably agrees with you a lot more.
Mhm. Absolutely.
And what you find a lot of the times when we have nations is that one moral tribe rules all the others. That is essentially the one in power. And so that morality tends to disseminate, sometimes slowly. That's why a lot of times, even though you have these opinions and you see it, you go, wait a minute, that doesn't feel quite right, because you still have your tribe. It's just your tribe is slowly being seeded with the rest. And that's why I cannot look back 80 years and, disconnect, because whatever power disseminated their opinions eventually just became part of my moral tribe.
And that is, I think, well said, because that you just admitted your moral has been put in your brain by your cultural bubble that you live in. And certainly you can push the boundaries and so on. Like you are one religion and you become another religion. But 95% of the people, they grow up in South Dakota, they are Christian. If they grow up in Kuwait, they are Muslim. They grow up in India, they're Buddhist. And their sense of morality is absolutely one-to-one taken from their culture, and that actually the power in that area is what enforced that churches were the governance for most of the history, and they are not. It's not much different now.
Well, a big part of this question to me, like my understanding of asking the question was even obtaining power. Like, can you obtain that level of power ethically or morally? Because I feel like a lot of these dictators aren't necessarily ethically obtaining their power.
Mhm.
They're maybe.
They disagree with you.
You disagree?
No, they disagree with
No.
you. They think it is necessary. When the first dictator came to life, Rome was chaos. People freely, happily made Caesar dictator in life. So we had that conversation before. We have an understanding about what our life, political, moral boundary look like. Everything is outside of that. It's for us becomes not good, not moral, and so on and so forth. Like, look at the people in China. They're not a democracy, but they're happy with their way of life. We have 2 Chinese here. Ask them. They don't want the American way of life. But we don't consider it well because for us, everybody has to have a voice and so on and so forth. So it all comes back to that. Now, everybody wants to be moral, okay? Everybody wants to do the best, be a good person, and so on and so forth. But if you go and dissect that, what that really is, I just can't tell you. Before you start judging another culture or another person for being immoral or not as good as you are, take a deep look into the mirror and find out where your own morality came from and what would you do to the people who don't adhere to your sense of morality.
I think that's a good ending. What would you do to people who don't adhere to your sense of morality? Okay. Does anyone have anything else to add before we close out?
It's good to go.
Thanks for watching. This was How We See the World. I'm Amanda Armagast.
I'm Melissa Haber.
Dominic Moore.
I'm Dr. Abbasi for Essence.
Thanks, guys.